Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. I'm delighted in this episode to be joined actually by another Mark, Mark Adams, who is the Social Inclusion Officer at Glasgow City Council and is also a trustee at North Kelvin Sport. Firstly, Mark, how are you? It's brilliant to have you on.
I'm well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, no, I've obviously we've met before, Mark, and one of the reasons why I was really excited to chat with you is that obviously you do so much work at the grounds level, and you have been for a long time. You can tell me the exact number of years. I don't want to accidentally insult you or give any sort of hint towards your age or anything like that. But you've been doing so much work in terms of is sort of in social enterprise projects that are kind of using sport as a vehicle again to further education and how to kind of create better citizens through sport, or at least on the side of sport. You'll be able to kind of help us understand the nuance a little bit more as we get into the conversation. But it's such meaningful work, and I think as coaches or people that are listening, coaching is a space, and coaching is also a microcosm of society, sport being that, and therefore we can't necessarily detach the issues that we have within society from some things, the issues that we have within sport. And what better actor then in sport than the coach, who's a leader and is someone that players will interact with and perhaps could learn from in this. And we'll get into a lot of those different topics. But maybe to kind of kick it off for us, and this is maybe also to kind of give a bit more information for the listeners, Mark, what kind of motivated you to enter into this space where you're at, and tell us a little bit about more of the work that you actually do currently, just again as a bit of an introduction.
So motivation really was about looking back at my upbringing, look at the way I was brought up, look at the way sport was delivered. I grew up in Kilmarnock in the 70s and 80s, so I'm quite happy for people to know my age. And I look at the lack of coaching we got. Actual fact, it was just a bunch of boys brought together. Best ones were put in the team, others were discarded. The way we were spoken to, there was no hint of an education either in terms of footballing or outside of football. A lot of violence, and that was accepted. A lot of unsavoury language, and that was normal. And just it was an unhealthy environment. And I always thought it shouldn't be like this. It should be better than that. Then years later, before I really get involved, I remember reading Jimmy Reid about the guys in the high flats. That guy could be the best pianist. That guy could be the best boxer. That guy could be the best gymnast. But nobody will never know because they'll never have the opportunity. And I just thought, we can make this better. And then about 25 years ago, maybe 26, 27 years ago now, I moved to Glasgow, which was kind of life-changing for me. I moved to North Kelvin side at that time, which is really kind of a suburb of Maryhill. And there's a lot of social challenges in Maryhill at that time, as there was in lots of parts of post-industrial Glasgow, post-industrial Scotland. And I just kind of moved into the community, and I wanted to embrace the community. And the word got out that I was a coach. And it turned out that the local football team had folded some years ago, and there was nothing there, if you like, for adults at that time. So we started a pub team. It was just as simple as that. We started North Kelvin United in 1999 in the Crosslands Bar, the old train spotting bar on the Queen Margaret Drive. And it grew arms and legs. We had various success and otherwise. Most success was just getting people on the pitch and giving people the opportunity to play. About 2004, 2005, the club had grown to be 2 or 3 different amateur teams. We had successfully saved the Red Ash pitches at the top of Queen Margaret Drive from being developed. And we thought, we kept getting asked about kids football. Why are you not doing kids football? So we thought, right, we'll start doing Sunday morning sessions, 50p, just turn up and get out in a formal session. And before you know it, we'd 50 kids turning up every week. And then the natural progression from that was the next week was, the next season, was, can we get teams for the kids? So we started, and at this stage, it was really volunteer-led. All the team coaches for the kids were all players in the adult teams, which is a good model, I believe, albeit it's time-consuming one. So that kind of grew arms and legs, and we had a lot of success for that. And then, believe it or not, 2007, I had gone back to university to do community development. It's not my background. My background was sales, telecommunications. And I totally retrained. And doing that degree, I had to do a work placement. So I did my work placement with Sense Over Sectarianism, the project with a lady called Alison Logan at Glasgow City Council, who I learned so much from. It's not possible. And also managed to get some funding to do anti-sectarian work with the club. And that was the game changer. Absolute game changer for me. I saw the difference we could make within a community club in Maryhill at that stage with less than 100 players. And we could challenge attitudes, we could challenge behaviour, we could challenge language simply by having people on the pitch or people in the games hall and talk about, right, why is that language inappropriate? Why should you not use that language? Or what does it actually mean? So it kind of just went and grew arms for legs from there. We formed the charity, formed the Skio at that time, and then moved very much into expansion and largely community work, because I didn't want the club just to be a football club. I wanted the club to be a sports development organisation or a community development organisation. So we did lots of different stuff. I could go into it. Over the years, we've done anti-sectarian work almost every year. We do Fit and Able for kids with don't get access to sport because of disabilities. We did Commonwealth Games projects about in 2014 and before, about understanding about people from different countries and just using again sport as that vehicle for education. I couldn't even tell you how many different projects we've done through different funding and stuff like that. But some of them, like Bridges and Barriers, which is a government-funded anti-sectarian programme, we've been doing that for 11 years now. And that has a footprint right across Glasgow, and that's not just a Mary Hill project now. So there's lots and lots of stuff, and that's kind of went hand in hand with sense over sectarianism. So I've moved through the paces, if you like, with SOS. I was a student, I became the schools officer, I became the dev officer, and now I'm the social inclusion officer. That's mainly because people moved through.
No, I mean,
so,
yeah.
Sorry, my rambling.
No, not interrupt you, Mark. No, absolutely. It was just to build on what you were saying there, because I mean, I had the pleasure of looking through a bit of your CV as well, and I know you've been involved in things not just with anti-sectarianism, but in terms of prevent campaigns, and you've done sort of like No Knives, Better Lives. You've done some sort of you've kind of mentioned about other sort of inclusivity projects, and it sounds like the thread across them, as you've already kind of spoken about, is about using sport as a catchment point. And for some people, sport plays really, if it's not even an uplifting role, maybe if anything, and just as a start point, it's a stabilising role. Because you'd mentioned obviously the time that you've worked from the community in sort of deprived areas. And it sounds like you've really used that role as an empowering tool for sort of social mobility. Maybe is this sort of like going towards that crux of things?
So one of the kids, Jason, who was one of our very first kid players, born in '97. Remember that, born in '97. So he went through all the way, did the university course at UWS, and then came back to the club as an employee. And he had been a player, and now he's gone on to be a teacher. And that's an absolute prime example of a boy for the Rockhill Milton area of Glasgow who's been empowered to learn and learn from his peers to go and do the work. So we've got examples now with this where kids have done the SOS programme, are now delivering or experiencing the SOS programme or delivering it as teachers in schools. And that's like for sustainability, the way we need to go. But I think a lot of what I've done is about the perception of sport, or perceptions. And I'll give you a good example of that. So I was in a primary school this morning working my primary 7 class, and I'm turning up with my coach outfit. Now, there's no coaching going on. There's no football going on. This is a classroom workshop. But the fact is, we dress all the boys in sports coach outfit because it just breaks down barriers. It opens doors. Kids are excited when you come in the door. They're listening. They're all attentive. I do a wee exercise. First thing, you have to close your eyes because you've only seen me for 7 seconds. The 7 seconds of prejudice theory. And you've got to say out loud after 7 seconds what you think about me. And it's sporty, tall, football coach. Now, they don't know I'm a football coach. They just, because they see me, and they're already engaged when you go through that, just that simple exercise in the way that I've looked. And I feel like that's a really powerful way to open doors. What I've always been about is formal education, but in an informal environment. So we're in a formal education statutory type of place, like a school, but we're delivering it in an informal way. We're delivering a workshop style delivery, and we get super engagement off of that. So similar to when I've been doing lectures at Glasgow Uni in the past for the PGDE course or the MDUT course, I'm the guy that comes in and does a workshop, not a lecture. And the levels of engagement are massive in terms of the evaluations that we get, etc. And we've not even delivered any sport. But you know what, issues like sectarianism and issues like violence reduction, I've done a lot of work in violence reduction, is about around the sporting sphere that lives in. So, for example, we're talking about examples of discrimination this morning, and some of you guys put about ultra fan groups, Rangers won at Celtic, and about violence potentially happening there. And that's a kind of normal thing that they would see online, or that their friends would talk about, or family members would talk about. And they feel in a safe space to talk to me about that because I'm presenting as a football coach.
So just that was, I mean, there's a couple of things that we can kind of, we'll rewind a little bit there and break down some of the stuff that you've mentioned. It's really interesting. I see in one level here, we're talking about being attuned to the social problems that actually affect the community you're working within. So you'd mentioned, sectarianism can be something that, or if it's not sectarianism, it could be knife crime, or it could be, where there's an attitude towards something, there's often just because of just the natural laws of influence, it's often, inhabited, or it's sort of it's within the bubble of where someone exists, and it's trying to also, I suppose, recognise therefore when you're talking to people in those spaces that they're going to bring certain preconceptions about things or certain thoughts and beliefs that are a product of not them as a person, but actually of where they're at and where the culture they're coming from. I would wonder, because you'd mentioned about, how you like to do workshops, and that it sounds to me like that's because you want conversation. And I'm just wondering, how do you, when I pair that up to also the technique you were talking about, look, you just dress as a coach and you want to see the primary kids, whatever. It sounds like you're quite attuned to understanding how to start a conversation, how to present an image that people would find approachable, and that, how do they things work together? Because in terms of how
I
that
think
works.
because we're coming from a youth work community development background, if you like. We're going into schools to talk about what kids want to talk about. So, for example, the first thing we'll do on the first, so when we work with our primary sibling class at SOS, Centre for Sectarianism, we'll work for 3 weeks with them over 3 workshops. The very first thing we do after a kind of icebreaker thing is do a thing about to get them engaged. First thing you do, like, get them to walk like an old person, get them to walk like a celebrity, get them to walk like a young person, have a great laugh and all that. But actually, right away, we've covered prejudice and stereotypes, which they can all identify with. Then we straight away go into mind mapping and mind map sectarianism. Now, what their perception of sectarianism would not be a dictionary definition or what you or I would understand it to be, but it will be the issues that they experience or the issues that they identify, and that's what we talk about. That's
It's
what.
it's interesting as well, because when you shape it in that way, we're thinking this is just as I want to build on this about how you actually have and start these conversations. You think about something as serious as sectarianism or racism or ageism, whatever the problem tends to be, because of the very fact, and I've just made the mistake, maybe I've made the mistake already. We think these are serious issues, so we'll only talk about it in serious ways. But sometimes we could be guilty of not being able to start a conversation because of just the tone in which we actually bring up the topic. And that sounds like a
Mhm.
really interesting thing that you've done, like a wee bit of fun if it's around, pretend you're an old person, and then you can get into talking about something that is more important around, if I don't know what the specific topic might be, but similarly, I'd imagine there's been things that you've done that's around Satanism that is just that becomes light-hearted to start with, just for engagement, and then you can start to explore more deeply, understanding and things like that.
100%, 100%. Because then we'll later in the workshop we'll be talking about violence. We'll be talking about people getting killed. With kids with
Mm,
Syria in the class this morning, so we're talking about the war in Syria, which for me was a sectarian war because you have different sects of Islam fighting each other, and we're
mm,
talking about that with 11-year-olds, and they're happy to have that conversation because there's a reason they're in Glasgow. It's a very diverse city. So our kids
mm,
experience racism. They experience sectarianism without maybe knowing what that is. They experience different type of stuff. But we will talk about it in a serious nature, but it's really like a non-prejudicial area. So, for example, end up talking about Hitler, right? So, because one of the kids said Adolf Hitler, he was a bigot, right? I'm like, yeah, that's right. And who did he kill? And one of the things was gay people. And another wee girl puts her hand up and says, "In my country, you're not allowed to be gay. It's against the law." And like, so she felt safe to share that in front of the class to me, who she's never met before, ever.
mm,
Right? And then we were able to discuss how that differs from country to country, and that's maybe about different religions, but it's also about accepting that people have different backgrounds, different ideas, and where those influences come from, and that's really what it's all about. And see, to go back to what you were talking about just a few minutes ago about talk about the key issues that kids want to talk about. Over that series of 3 workshops, when we do the third one, we talk about what do you really like about Glasgow and what do you really dislike about Glasgow. So if the big issue in there, I remember working in Cranhill years ago, and it was mums against drugs. Drugs are everywhere anyway, but that particular community was blighted. So it's no point me getting in there and ponying up talking about sectarianism and about religious bigotry, because that's not the problem that they've got on their street. So we would talk about in start real terms about how many men are in Berlin jail because of drug-related crime. We talk about the highest drug deaths in Europe. We talk about how easy it is to buy drugs and what drugs they know about in their street, because that's a youth focus. It's a person-centered model of change, but it's a person-led model of change. You need to talk to the kids about what they need to talk about. It's not about, here's a set curriculum, go and talk about that set curriculum.
So when and I'm doing also we'll kind of bring this into, and actually not, we're not bringing this into coaching quarters. We are already brought into coaching quarters, but we might, the conversation might extend soon to how we actually maybe in the side of a football park or within a changing room space, we might chat about these things. But it sounds like this has been sort of bottoms up in the way that we think about and start these conversations. Just you could go in. And I'd assume to some degree that in some projects you've probably worked in, Mark, where there is a bit of a preset agenda, and and for good reasons they've spoken, heard voices, and we need to construct some sort of syllabus. But I'd imagine in terms of how you actually follow through on that and execute that, it sounds very much like you've not started with here's the agenda. You maybe are better starting with, let's talk about some stuff, and you help me understand where the agenda is based on maybe framing where you're at right now and how you think and what the problems are around for yous, and then from there you're kind of bringing things together more. Is that a better planning tool, thinking of it that way? It's not
So we have a
so
framework
pre-packaged.
Yeah, we have a kind of PowerPoint pre-packaged because images are strong and we want to include all learners.
Yeah.
Right, so not all learners have got the confidence to speak out. Not all learners have got the literacy skills, but some of them prefer graphics and videos and stuff. So we make it very interactive, but we show the slides that are appertain to what they're talking about. But it's always about being prepared for that sort of stuff. But I think a lot of it, what it's about, is about what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. For example, like you speak to kids, you talk about in a changing room environment. I don't allow name calling. I've never allowed it, right? And in the classroom, we'll say to kids, who likes getting called names? Because that's a form of discrimination. And nobody's hand up. I'll say, right, be honest with me, put your hand up if you've ever called someone a name, and every hand goes up, right? And nobody's enjoyed that experience, but they've done it. So we'll get them to think about why they would do it. And also, like, I grew up in dressing rooms that were absolutely brutal, right? Playing at Ayrshire amateurs and Glasgow amateurs and stuff like that. Absolutely brutal. All the homophobe stuff of the day, all the racist stuff of the day, which was, I think, acceptable in the 80s or accepted in the 80s, 90s, wouldn't happen now just because it's not acceptable. And we've managed to get to a space through sport where the last bastion or environment where that stuff would have been permitted, it's no longer accepted. If you follow me on that.
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
going to change because it's been challenged. I'd be one of the guys eventually. I would challenge that in a dressing room. You can't use that language. You can't call this guy this. Or I've had instances as a coach where we've had homophobic language from opposition. I will absolutely call that out every single time. I had a match in the Lowland League when I was a manager in the Lowland League where one of my black players was racially abused. I 100% challenged that right away there and then. You can't just say, oh, it's all right, or we'll shake hands at the end. Absolute nonsense. It has to be addressed at that stage. So what I'm saying is person-led, but also personal responsibility. What's happening about you? What can you do about that?
And it comes through so clearly now when you've added a wee bit of an example to that as well. I'm wondering, because I also get the feel that you seem to be very big, Mark, on understanding, not necessarily agreeing, but understanding to help you understand how the conversation needs to go next. Because you gave that example of the girl puts her hand up, says something that you maybe don't agree with, but as a means of continuing and keeping the conversation stream open, it's not about chastising people. Because I always think that we're always feeling very well intended about we want to educate and stuff or whatever, or shape the culture and change things. But if we do nothing other than as soon as we hear something that isn't correct, we just attack that where the voice is, whatever voice that is came from. They're not actually opening up a stream where ignorance can actually be dissected and we can understand positioning and where it's came from as a means of actually helping somebody. Like, because I always think we're talking in context, for example, anti-sectarianism. There are kids, a lot of times it's primarily young kids, it could be boys, who will say things and say words that they do not fully understand the history behind, and they do not fully. And it's like, are we better to, we don't agree with the words and we tell them so, but we need to be careful about how we address it, because we want to address it in a way that we start a conversation, we don't end one. because that's not
Yeah.
necessarily always a good route towards real education and real bettering of people, isn't it? And I think a lot of times the rhetoric that coaches are given in terms of around principles of inclusivity it's the riot act. But what you offer a quite a cool blueprint for, and we might get into more, is we need that on one side, but how do we actually change people as
Yeah.
well? How do we actually improve people? And that isn't
So I
always
think,
the riot act.
and no, of course not. It's to understand that there is a base in ignorance, but there's also like a huge influence in people's lives. And you have to
Mm,
understand, like, we're not about telling kids they're bigots, and we're not about to tell kids their dad's a bigot either,
mm,
right? That's not what we're about. But we're about telling kids, right? So you're using this language, you use the word Fenian. What does that mean?
mm,
Where have you heard it? Why do you think it's okay to use it? Do you think some people would be offended? Why would they be offended? Where might this happen in the environment? What do you think people think about you if you use language like that? And just say, and have those conversations in a non-judgmental manner, because it's all learned behaviour. It's tribalism, or it's learned behaviour, or it's exciting. If you see it, people getting involved in this sort of stuff, and you might think, oh, that's acceptable in a football environment, like the 90-minute bigot theory, which I don't condone at all. Whereas
mm,
it's all right to call people names and act in a certain way in the 90 minutes of a game because it's only a game. I don't believe that. If you think that in a game, you think that in society. So
mm,
I think it's about one of the exercises we do, Mark, is called the A to Z, right? It's an old youth work tool. You get the kids to work together to come up with something for every letter of the alphabet they associate with sectarianism. Hun, Fenian, Tim, all and more will come out,
mm,
right? And that's just an opportunity then to challenge it, because those kids aren't going to volunteer that information just standing in front saying, what do you think? So they
mm,
work together, they've come up with what they understand it to be, and then we say, right, okay, where's the thing that comes from? Where's that from? And then we do a whole exercise about influences. Who are your primary influence? What is an influence? Who's your secondary influence? Who's your outside influence? And this is always a good one. Who's your influences that you're not aware as are your influences? So, for example, kids will say politicians don't influence me. I'll say, right, who shut schools at COVID? I'll say, right, why every time you go to the shop for your sweets and your crisps, they're more expensive now? And it's politicians. Why's your mum struggling to heat the house? Because it's politicians. And that whole thing about understanding that you're being influenced all the time, like modern kids don't watch telly, they watch YouTube, for example. And I say to kids, so unless you've got premium, what are you watching before you watch anything on YouTube? You're watching an
mm.
advert, right? So you get subliminal influence is happening all the time. I say, so if you're listening to watch someone on YouTube, what happens next? Or something else comes up. So you've then been influenced to think about and watch something else. And that can be
Mm.
like, oh, and I know that I'm preaching to the converted with this stuff, but I'm getting kids to think about how they think, where are their values and attitudes formed, and how are they formed?
You know what, Dukes? I mean, it's spot on, and the reason I say that is that I mean, it sounds like you're trying to teach people to be more independent thinkers because, and you consider today, and particularly, but I know we're focusing on young people here, but it could happen. It happens across, and adults need to learn as well, which is one of the influences on young people. But we consider how impressionable a young mind is, and also sort of this is the social space they're in, where it's about conformity, and that
Mm-hmm.
and that leads itself. Before we even get into the whole fact that, let's be honest, like media and social media, for example, has algorithms that will show you more of what you want to find a little bit about. So
Mm-hmm.
if we couple the fact that kids are quite impressionable with the fact that they could be exposed to a single message that is just reiterated time after time again, based on not only who they're around, but also where they're at in terms of if it's online, um, or if it's in football parts, it could be the equivalent of that for different issues across different sports and different cultures for other people that maybe are listening in different walks of life. But um, these are ways in which people will unconsciously assimilate and actually propagate information that isn't either accurate, isn't helpful, is harmful most of the ways. Where it sounds like the only remedy to that is we need to instill as early and as quickly as we can independent thought. And
Mm-hmm.
and one of the issues I always feel like coaches have as well, and I say this more so from experience, where you're trying to, let's think about just instilling something, not even that's more society minded, but like something around the classic focus on learning over winning. It's all very well a coach saying that, but as soon as a kid gets out of the car and a parent says something that's different,
Right.
their influence will always outweigh ours.
That's
But it
important
sounds
because
like
it does.
that's a real tool. The fact that you're also the same way of giving your own thought, you're also teaching influence.
Aye.
That's an empowering way to help the kid maybe combat wider influence that can have a real effect on them.
No, because in that example, the kids knows the first question their dad's going to ask them is what? Did you win? First
Mm,
question, not did you enjoy it, not did how the game go. I would say 80% will be did you win. So the kids are getting influence right away. There's a pressure in terms of coaching about how you win. It's not about how you conducted yourself or so
mm,
on. So I'll give you an example of that where we try to change that culture. At North Kelvin, our 2012 had our very, very first 11-a-side game on Saturday morning. Now, I've coached some of those kids since they were like really, really small. And they lost 6-0, and that was fine. And see, at the end, it was all well done, really well done. Who played well? Oh, he played well, he did well. Did we keep our shape well? Good. What did we do good in the game? I know, and even if we'd got one goal in that game, there would have been an even bigger success. The wee guys were euphoric. They'd got out on our grass, full size pitch, and played their first ever game of 11. Winning or losing, I know this sounds like people people will kill me for this saying it didn't
mm.
matter. It actually didn't matter. It was our first time wearing the strip. Can you remember your first game of 11s wearing the strip? Do you know what I mean?
I
How big
know.
a day is that in your life?
I know. I actually do remember. I think it was 7v7, but I actually do remember, and it's a big event. Like it does feel big to you, so there's a lot of things that can go on in your head. Yeah. Is it, and the flip side of that as well? Then I know we're talking about like teaching them about influence, helping sort of foster sort of more independent thought. But obviously, the more we can collaborate with outside influence, the better it is. So, I mean, what would your take be? Because a lot of times as coaches, knowing that, parents and maybe other coaches or friends at school, if we're trying to create cultures that are conducive to change and or at least adaptive behaviours for whatever that could be, and that I know this is more termed around societal issues, but is there anything that you would recommend or do then that helps bring in these key actors and helps them be part of the solution, and also so that you get buy-in from them? Because I know a lot of times, particularly when you're on, and I say this because a lot of the topics that you've discussed, anti-sectarianism, racism, well, of course, to any rational person, these are quite quite obvious, there's quite obvious answers to some of these questions when we consider the complexity of where people come from.
Mm-hmm.
But
I think
there isn't
like
always obvious answers, therefore the actors that are around them, they maybe need to be, brought on board, and then you need to have a level of compromise sometimes to build somewhere,
I
maybe.
think that you have to be you have to have cognizance as a coach of a particular youth team. You're not just a role model or an influencer for the kids. You're also a role model and
Hmm.
influencer for the parents, right? So for that game on Saturday, for example, and I've done this countless times over the years, I got all the parents together before the game. Says by
Hmm.
all means support the kids. By all means encourage the kids. Do not criticise and do not coach. Right? It's dead simple. The coaches have worked with the kids. It's distracting for the kids. They want to have a positive experience. And I said to a couple of them, I says, you're as old as me. You'll have had the different environment for me, or the same environment as me, where you would get shouted and sworn at. And if you did something wrong or did something, that's not happening anymore. That's, we've moved on. And I've got great buy-in for the parents because I've actually took the time to have a chat with them. I've not just
Hmm.
waited for it to happen and then just went argumentative to someone, because if I do that and challenge that behaviour, somebody's got to lose face pretty quickly, and that's not going to work. Right? So see if you can have these conversations in an open manner right up front, and then and it's a great thing I always believe is self-policing. Like I think like if you demonstrate your behaviour by your positive behaviour and also by challenging negative behaviour, but do it in the right way. If you like, so here's another one for you just now. Coaching, I've just taken over this under 17 squad this year. So, and this will sound like old school teacher, like I'm not tolerating any language. I'm not tolerating swearing at all between each other, banter, on the pitch. I'm just not tolerating it. But in order for me to be realistic with that, I can't be swearing.
Hmm.
I can't. I need to be that role model. That I'm not the guy who makes a mistake and shouts F's and blinds or whatever. And people that know me know that have heard me in a dressing room probably I'll be saying he's a liar, right? But working with youth teams, I'm just not tolerating it.
Hmm.
So I want a more positive environment. I want the guys to support each other and help each other more. And I know that's a wee bit off topic for what you're talking about, but I think it's about that
No,
that role
aye.
model environment.
But I think it's totally on topic because you could extend that to, you don't swear because you're understanding how to act in a professional space. If you're talking about in a performance focused setting, for example, and you're trying to create, let's say, young professional athletes, they have to, if it's not at the start, certainly as they get older and closer towards the point where they're expected to act in certain ways, you need to be that role model. I always think, and let's maybe take it back to, and if you will, if you um, do this with me, I always think, and it's just even from my own experience, like with young men, for example, where there's a very, is one of the sort of social challenges I think with young boys that we're trying to get at, and coaches can help towards, is like obviously being more communicative around like mental health, and being more communicative around like emotions and stuff. So it's, I mean, it's something that when you're saying about like you want to set bad language, like as a role model, another equivalent to that for me has always been like talk and be quite open about telling them when you feel anxious and anxiety, and try to kind of show vulnerability wherever you can to young men, because I think it helps normalize that in a space where otherwise maybe they're used to being more stoic and more sort of closed off.
Yep.
And that's just because I just wonder if you can maybe speak to some of these topics that we might even contextualize to that group in per se. Because I know often you can talk to young men also around things like misogyny. Why can't coaches be combating that with that particular group by having everyday conversations, being monitoring, aware and conscious, and looking for learning opportunities, not even to put the right boot out, but learning opportunities. Listen to what they talk about. See if you can be that key person that helps shape change. Is that kind of like building on what you're saying a little bit, Mark? Because it just that speaks to me quite a bit actually.
Right. So there's the trusted model, or the trusted adult, sorry, which is obviously there for kids, but it's also there for adults. Right.
Mm,
So I have had players who come and spoken to me about mental health issues, or I'm struggling, or I've got a lot I've coached 7 years in the university environment. I'm really struggling with my workload, blah, blah, blah. And and the old school coaches like, blah, 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 fitness first. Actual fact,
mm,
no, you maybe need to take some time. Maybe need that space. You maybe need to concentrate. And the fact that they've had the confidence that they can approach you and speak to you about that tells you you're doing something right. And I feel that's important. Things like misogyny, for example, this is something we're challenging more in primary schools, believe it or not, the whole Andrew Tate
mm,
stuff, right? Because we'll openly have that conversation. How do you think he makes his money? Or because they don't know how he makes his money. They just see
mm,
the cars and the cigars and they see the glamour. And we say, right, what is misogyny? Right, hating women. So is it all right for him to hate your mum? Is it all right
mm,
to hate your sister? No, it's not. And the kids will be like, no chance. So what I'm trying to do is present like a trusted individual. So when I say that, they believe me, because
mm,
that's I'm not the guy saying, "Oh, this is brilliant. Oh, he's a this or he's a that," or "Well, look at his motors." Do you know what I mean? I'm the guy that's probably saying the other thing.
mm,
One of the programs that I work on or deliver for Glasgow is the Mentors and Violence Prevention program, which is about reducing gender-based violence, and we do amazing work with that with absolutely no budget, and we
mm,
deliver that in about 21 of the 30 secondary schools. So we're coming up against that all the time, and that's a non-sporting environment. But what I'm doing with that is I'm encouraging schools all the time to recruit boys to be educating other boys about misogyny, not to be getting lectured at by teachers or other young women, because it's much
mm.
more powerful if we can use the leaders in the
And
actual
does that tie in? You'd mentioned at North Kelvin as well, where you are trying wherever you can to get older players to transition into coaching roles as well, or to have some. Is that, does that play into that as well? I wonder, is another layer of then not
I
just
think
it's
it makes it
someone that I look up to, but they're near us and they're talking about certain things.
it makes it aspirational. It's something that I'm trying to change just at the minute. Previous kind of heads of football have not really bought into this, but we've been doing it over summer. We did 6 week summer camp there, averaging 70 kids a day, and a couple of the coaches at different times were kids who play for the older teams. So one of the 17s and one of the 15s was out delivering actual coaching. And how is that not inspirational to a 5-year-old, 6-year-old?
Mm,
Or we have like the young boys who are like the young coaches. I feel like there's give my age away again, young boys who have just graduated from maybe still in university, with two of them who are now playing, one's playing still in Albion, one's playing at Irvine Meadow. That's aspirational. That's
yeah.
100% aspirational, because they've done well, they've worked hard at school, they've done university football, and look what they've got now. So for me, that's role model stuff as well. That's role model stuff without probably doing anything other than just being a good coach that listens to the kids can go and speak to, and it's almost like it's an experience for them where they'll enjoy football, but also they'll enjoy the environment of football.
Mm. Does it also kind of talks a little bit to knowing your audience, knowing what the exact issue is you're wanting to challenge, and then creating an environment that helps towards that. So if we went back to the very start, we're talking about working in deprived communities where social mobility is more what the agenda is and starting to uplift people. Well, while you're also trying to do that by maybe thrusting someone into a responsibility role, where a kid or a young person hasn't previously been trusted to do that, you're also then providing a mirror that younger kids who are then coached by that older kid can look at what they could be, and as much as be able to just obviously receive it, and you're helping not just the person but the people that are around them. It's all through aspiration.
Yeah, one of those young coaches had since COVID has had major issues with anxiety, and it took him half an hour to go on the pitch on the first day, but the support of the other coaches who are, his at that stage now his peers, even though they're quite a bit older than him. And he ended up working on summer camp for 3 weeks. And like the feedback we had to his parents and from him, he said he's a really good kid, but he's had a bit of a hard time. But the power of football, the power of sport has helped him overcome his anxiety. And obviously he's then, within about 3 days, he was taking his own group. He wasn't even assisting. He was taking his own group.
I mean, you mentioned as well, because you had mentioned, Mark, around that classic coach who just wants to make everything back to the sport that they coach. I know as a culture we kind of, maybe it's the way we train our coaches. It's very led by the technical, tactical, and there's a wee bit given to social, psychological, whatever, but it's still very much fed in. It's coaching's in the drill. But what I think you're suggesting, certainly something I've always believed is that, see if you go to a session and actually you spent 10 to 15 minutes talking to people about something that was really meaningful. See, even inside a performance focused space, that is coaching. Like that, there's a meaningful impact that you're having to someone. It doesn't, it really depends on if you see the sport as being the vehicle or you see the sport as the end point. That to me, even across those different general agendas in terms of where you're at, if it's community versus performance, these are all coaching acts. But I don't know if I really fed that as much or given so much training about that. As far as I've seen, whenever you have a typical conversation with a coach around their social obligations, sportsmanship's one of them. That's the classic one, and actually probably that's as far as the conversation typically goes. We don't condone cheating, and make sure you don't do that. But that will obviously have societal consequence. But there's other issues, and I don't know if it just comes from a lack of confidence through lack of training, that maybe coaches don't feel like they want to have the conversations and have such an active role in it. Maybe it's not their job, and maybe there's too much potential consequence to getting tied up into these sorts of mazes that they can seem like.
I think it's a lot about confidence as well, right? So, having been sacked twice as a professional manager or semi-professional manager, it is a results-based business, and sport, as you say, is the end-based result. But actually, that particular game is not the last game you'll ever play. I mean, I'm a guy that played amateurs till I was nearly 48. I couldn't get off a pitch. They couldn't try to shoot me to get me off a pitch. Right? I just couldn't give it up. I was coaching at a high level, and so I started turning out Sunday league so I could still play. And I just love the game, and I want other people to love the game and love that environment. And I think what I talk about with kids is in youth teams more than adult teams, I guess, is about attitude and performance. Can we do better than we did last game? And can we show a good attitude? Because not just to each other, but to the opposition, to the referee. If you're getting shouted at by opposition parents, which unfortunately happens far too much, don't react. Be the bigger person in that, and understand that that's not personal what they're saying to you, albeit it sounds at that time, and there's a correct way to act with that. I think so if I take, for example, David Proctor up at the Colts, he's a great example of a kind of guy who played professional football, who's not a ranter and a raver, who's looking for a performance and looking for attitude all the time. And I just think, well, I went out when I was between jobs here. He was good enough to have me in for a couple of sessions, and I'm like, this is a wee bit different for what I'm used to in my last job coaching in the West of Scotland League, where there is a lot of ranting and raving and people giving absolute dogs to referees and opposition coaches and players and stuff like that. And I thought, there's a reason you've played the level you've played, and the reason you're coaching the level you're coached. It's because of your attitude and how you frame things. And I just thought, well, and I'm making no bones about my age. I'm at the higher end of a football coach's age. I'm still learning. I worked with Chris Geddes for 5 years, still in university. He's a rookie coach, and they brought me in really to support him as an experienced coach. But I was by the second year or whatever, or I'm learning off him as well. So learning is something that doesn't stop. Learning is not something that I go to school and I learn and that's it, and I go out to the workplace. Learning is something. I know that sounds a cliche, and I sound a bit like Michael Chew now, But the learning goes on. The learning goes on forever. And I mean, I'm still learning all the time, and I think that's the whole point of it. The whole point of being involved in sport and being the best that you can be. I'm not the best coach in the world, but I'm as good as I can be because I'm showing the right attitude and I'm trying to give a performance. I'm not the best community development worker, for example, because I'm always learning. So I just
But
think
doesn't it
that's
open it up? But in some ways, a social agenda opens up what can make a really good coach to lots of different types of people. Because, like, I know that there's more to coaching than just, you know, having that agenda as such, but you could still be a very good coach, or you could still do a decent enough job if you make up for maybe what you lack in the more conventional stuff that we associate with coaching with what you bring to the table interpersonally, culturally, you know, looking at these sort of issues. And I wonder if coaches maybe need to be empowered more to bring their own biographies with them, because, well, I mean, I remember Mark, a similar sort of, I'd interviewed an individual for my PhD, and I remember this coach had came from quite a rough area, and where they'd experienced a lot of sort of street crime and, you know, youth crime and stuff like that. And one of the main things when he worked with the young kids that he worked with, and he was a great coach, was he just wants, when these boys grow up, if they see each other in a dancing, that they'll know and they'll remember that they played in each other's team, and there isn't going to be any aggro, and they just say hi to each other and then they go their merry way. He didn't really care. Obviously, he did care about certain things week to week, whatever, and there was probably all the other things that he got caught up in his mind as well. But he came from a space where you being from a different street than me meant a lot. And he brought that into his coaching. And I think that made him a very good coach because he was a socially aware coach. And that
social
kind of brings
cohesion.
back, yeah.
I'll give you an example of that. Like I grew up in a big housing scheme in Kilmarnock with not a lot to do. And there was a Catholic school, and at that time it was a Protestant school, and every year the fourth years would fight. It was almost like on the calendar. It was almost like something that happened. And there was in this big scheme of about 12,000 people. We didn't have a football club, and a guy or a couple of guys started the football club. So what happened was, who's playing in the football club? Well, the best boys for the Catholic school and the best boys for the Church of Scotland school, and they're all mates all of a sudden. And you know what happens the next year, Mark? And this sounds like such a cliche. The fight didn't happen.
I
It
know.
just didn't happen because you're not going to fight your mates. And it would be those main actors who would be in both of those spheres, probably the guys who would be doing the fighting and the guys who would be playing football. It just was. And that was like simple. It sounds so simple, but if we think about how we teach in schools the Sense of a Sectarianism project, like whether it's sports festivals or workshops environment, we've taken right through Duncan Morrow's Tackling Sectarianism Task Force report. Social cohesion, bring people together. So we have a huge program where I twin kids from non-denominational schools and Catholic schools, and we work together both in the classroom and on the pitch, and just simply getting to know each other.
And do we need to get braver about what that really means, bring people together? Because I'm interested in your opinion on this. I know that there's some, and this isn't just extend to a sort of Rangers Celtic thing, but where often you get rival sport teams, sometimes where there's been issues, social issues attached to that on the side, a lot of coaches will be prone to saying, let's just keep no football, no Celtic Rangers tops or whatever at training. And it's kind of like, and in some sense I get it, but other sense I'm like, how do you help teach people to live together and be together if you aren't getting a space where they're allowed to authentically
Yeah,
be together?
We have that in schools in Glasgow. Kids are not encouraged to wear
Aye.
Rangers Celtic strips in school. But how do you promote tolerance? How do you promote respect?
Yeah, and then also then it's about also not, as I say, chastising people if they come out with a comment that shows an ignorance and therefore maybe shows an opportunity for you to educate them, and not, as I say, just to meet them where they're at, and then you can build from there within reasons, obviously. But it just touches on that about what we're trying to really do. Are we trying to punish, or are we trying to promote and uplift people? And that's it takes a lot of, and this maybe goes to why I wonder what your feeling is on this. Is a sort of is something that each man of their own has to try and accomplish and do their wee bit in, and I think there is a lot of truth in that. But I think coaches probably need to be empowered to go and take on these issues with a bit more rigor and a bit more active involvement and try to tackle them,
I think it's
because you're only as good as the support you've got behind you sometimes.
definitely, and I think it's about understanding what you think is acceptable and challenging what you think is unacceptable. And
Yeah.
it's not a here you mate. It's a by the way, or Do you think that's the right thing to be saying?
Yeah, and I wonder then in terms of when you're dealing with individuals and that's if we take it back to a coaching space, I've been in conversations sometimes if it's maybe working with young boys or whoever they could be, sometimes depending on the group that you're working with, maybe the maturity level or not even that, just maybe where they're just at and they've maybe necessarily not had people chatting to them and want to have a conversation about certain topics. And sometimes how someone acts at the time doesn't always paint a isn't
Accurate
always
picture.
representative of actually the impact you're having on them. Because I know that there's conversations I've had if it's maybe if I'm talking to other, and I'll go back to the example, I'm always quite deliberate about sharing my emotions, particularly when I'm talking to young men and try to really readdress what it means to be a man and how actually being a man and strength comes from vulnerability and messaging that I think is important. And I know that half the time when I say that, they're looking at each other, they're giggling, they're like smiling, and you're like, you may think, and I say this and just for the purpose of coaches that maybe I want to have similar conversations about different topics that affect who's in front of them. You might think you're not getting through them, but you're probably like when that kid goes away, when they stop being with their pals, there's something going to be in their head and there's something they're going to think about. And I just wonder what experience you've had with how you evaluate the impact you can have on people at the time outside, because we aren't all able to take surveys and
No,
things that we know. So is that coach is trying their best? How can they feel that they should keep doing with what they're doing, even if sometimes the signs aren't always great? If it's not an overnight fix or these sorts of things, what can we do in that like what's your opinion on that?
it's, evaluating social change is the hardest thing in the world, and as an academic, you'll know that definitely. I think so. For example, if you talk about some of the examples you're talking about, I'm about promoting positive masculinity. I've not really
Mm,
coached girls or women. I've coached young men or like adult players most of the time. And what I'm always, yes, as you say, how do you be a man? What's the correct way to be a man? But I'm all about positive masculinity.
mm,
And when people want to talk men down, talk about toxic masculinity, you're already on a race to the bottom. Actually, let's get in
mm,
a race to the top and actually promote that. So I would say, like, me personally, how I've experienced that is by young guys stop me in the street, young guys stop me in the gym. It happened to me in the pub in Saturday, believe it or not, a guy that I coached like maybe 7 or 8 years ago, just coming up and just saying to me what a brilliant coach I was and what a brilliant influence I'd been in his life. And I'm like, I'm embarrassed, right? I'm mortified. I'm standing in the middle of my local watch. Do you know what I mean? But actually, that's probably the best way you can capture that sort of stuff, that kind of anecdotal stuff. Yes, you can do the
mm,
formal environment in a school, but sorry, a formal evaluation in the school environment. You can't do it. You can't do it in a semi-professional football environment. So
mm,
that's kind of, I think, where you are. I think that even like a couple of times when I've been sacked as a manager, the amount of messages I've had off players, like apologising or supporting me, or do you know what I mean? Just like and when I left Stirling Uni and it was obviously to take another job, the amount of messages I got about thanking me for my time, thanking me for my influence on them as a coach,
mm.
and helping them develop as players. I think
So,
that's how you evaluate that probably.
so yeah, but it sounds like it's like a legacy project almost. Maybe it's kind of like
Definitely.
there's and maybe there's an element of faith having to be kept in there. Then of just when you feel you're acting in a way that you feel is morally just, that you've also had backing towards that. You just keep at it, and that hopefully the proof will be in the pudding, and the people you're trying to create and the people you're trying to develop and uplift, as we were saying. How do you think? So let's think more practical then. 'Kay, I know obviously a lot of stuff that you've done is in the classroom, but I know that you've also done work where it's out in clubs, if you've visited clubs and stuff like that, Mark.
Yeah.
How do we actually facilitate those conversations? Is it always should it be just on the side of the park by sort of when it's serendipitous to just there's a moment that just appears and we need to act on it, or can it also be something that kind of like you've done in the past and maybe you can expand a little bit on it for us, but it is a bit of a coordinated activity. There's before training, come in 15 minutes early, where do they chat about something, where do they do something that's
Aye.
active, and that what's your approach? What do you think's most helpful? Is it a combination of both? What's just your experiences around that? How do coaches listening and they want to do something, they want to talk about a particular issue, if it's gender, if it's sex, if it's racism, if it's sectarianism, knife violence, whatever it is, how would they maybe schedule that conversation?
So what I would say is, see a one-off interaction, a one-off intervention, almost a waste of time.
Mm.
almost a waste of time. But a one-off interaction can be the kickstart to a change over a period of time if that is followed up by what happens outside of the park. So, for example, the program you're talking about, when we got a bit of money and we sponsored the Lowland Development League, we offered the clubs, the under 20 squads, workshops. So I would
Mm.
go out, or somebody else would go out and do the chat, and it would be just 15 minutes training session, because at the end of the day, boys are giving up their nights to go and play football. They're not giving up their nights to get educated. But have a conversation, but do it again in a workshop manner. I'm Mr. Workshop. I feel like I can do to just sit there and talk about stuff, but I like to get people interacting. I like to get people telling me what they think. Then I can work with that. But then what you have to insist on is that the coaching team are also involved in that, so that it's not just like the coaching team go away and talk about tactics and the players listen to the workshop. The coaching team need to get educated as well, so that going forward they can talk about these topics and they can challenge these topics. And so, for example, if there is homophobic language, just for talk's sake, because that still happens in football, unfortunately, is that you can challenge that because you're educated to know that it should be challenged in the first place. You're
Yeah.
educated to know how the offence is taken, not given. Just because you're not offended doesn't mean the other person's not offended. And also to say, right, how does that make you look as an individual, both the player, and how does that make you look as an individual, the coach, if you're permitting your players to act in that manner?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think a lot of times workshops it's like a plaster treatment because too much value is attached to them. And when they're done in isolation, if they're done across and they're consistent, still better than nothing. But if they're done in isolation, and oftentimes if it's external, like, kind of know that people would be quite happy and understandably so, if they're maybe not that well versed in it, to have someone from the outside maybe come in. But if you aren't, it sounds like what you're saying as well, if you aren't conscious about trying to over time learn that material and learn the stuff that they need to speak about so that you can be that actor that's present at all times. So it's a culture, it's not just an episode. It's the intervention isn't an episodic thing that happens and then it's or even it certainly isn't something that's done ad hoc where it's just, for as long as we need to do it and then no longer. It should be something that's part of general behavior, and that really does. I think that what you're saying there speaks to that, I think, a lot, because I just think that's so powerful. You need to empower people and educate people so that they can do, self-policing, the stuff that we had mentioned earlier.
Aye.
Um,
That's all about professional standards as well. And
mm,
one of the big things that I believe in, whether it's for the coaching football, or I worked for 3 years in a program called Soccer Success, which was for non-engaged 15-year-olds who didn't want to go to school, and pretty much schools didn't want them either. They came to me and
mm,
one of my colleagues for, we put a whole program together for them, and we did alternative curriculum and stuff like that. But we had a zero tolerance for small things like timekeeping and like turning up with your tracksuit on and having a pencil for the classroom stuff, and just having that wee bit of discipline. But it was never the big stuff. It was always just the wee stuff that we laid on. And I would be seen as the coach in that environment. So you knew that if you could deal with the small stuff, or if everybody adhered to the small stuff, the big stuff didn't really happen, or it happened.
mm,
And I've not been unkind when I talk about this cohort. They would be not like unfamiliar with violence. And working with 3 groups of 40, mainly boys, I only get like challenged twice, like kind of squared up, if you like, by young people twice in 3 years, which I think is, was probably a result. But I
yeah,
think you
yeah.
take that into how you live your life. So my very first ever game coaching, still in university, working with Chris Geddes. The boys at the end of the game, it was summer, it was really hot, it was in Broxburn, and the boys all just left their empty water bottles outside the park. I dragged every single person back out that dressing room and made them pick it up.
Mm, mm,
And I know that's not about challenging sectarianism or not about misogyny or anything like that, but it's about professional standards and it's about personal standards. It's like, is it acceptable for you to leave someone else's area in that mess and to clean up for you?
mm.
Because I just don't believe that.
It does. Where does praise come into it in terms of how do you just obviously once we send a message to people, we want to help reinforce it, and praise is just a quite a natural mechanism that we might use for that. Like if we're talking about we want people to be more supportive of one another. It's just if it's not even in a quite a sort of general space like that, the next time you see someone being supportive, then you'd expect, it makes sense to then say well done. But how do you what's your take on how you reinforce and praise? Because and again, I just wonder, is praise not quite an important thing to remember as part of an educational process? Because like I was saying, it isn't about punishing people and you should do that and this. People are at where they're at, and sometimes should we not use praise as a way of reminding people that they're good people, You know, and because I wonder about people can very easily blamed. There's a lot of people that are blamed, and it can be quite demoralising as well for a lot of societal issues that they themselves don't often play a part in, but at least not directly, but it could be a cumulative effect or whatever. But I think people do get turned off a lot of times from education programs where they feel like a villain, and again that maybe talks to the need to maybe it's a balance in that. Is this about education, but also praising them and talking about where they've done well and where they're already good, and different aspects like that. If anything, to open up the communication and keep the communication streams open.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. It's that, and this is a cliche. West of Scotland man doesn't seek nor give praise, and it's because you never brought like I see football now, right? For example, not to talk bad about my dad, but I think he came to watch me play football about twice. And if you look at kids now, their parents are out watching their training, never mind their game. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, and so it is a different environment we work in now, and it is a much more risk-averse society. So kids need to feel good about themselves and need to feel like valued. So you will, like at North Kelvin, for example, with the kids, we will bring them in at the end of the session. What did we do well? How would that go? Did you enjoy it? That sort of stuff. We will do that much more than would have happened in my day. Definitely not. I think, like, in terms of praise, I think I'm very much on vocal praise, like make a demonstration of it. That was really well done. That's a really good. That's great. And even like talking about that girl earlier on, it talked about the like no gay people in Eritrea. I says to her, I says, thank you very much for sharing that. The class really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Because it's understanding people. Yeah, because is that not understanding people's potential and recognizing look that the comment itself needed addressed and you're working on it, but what you're seeing there is someone who's capable of speaking their mind, someone who, if that energy is redirected in a more positive way, can create, can be really valuable to society and other people around them. And it's like that. Because I see a lot of the stuff. Mark, for some of the listeners that have an interest in sort of research in this area, a framework that I think is really apt for this, and I had a previous conversation actually around its use with Jordan Donnelly, who done a lot of his kind of work around sort of sport for development programs, and it's a thing called transformational leadership. And a big part of that isn't just the the intellectual stimulation of trying to get them to think and kind of, as you've addressed, talk about your influences. Like that in itself isn't something people would normally look at. It's also actually that sort of inspirational motivation, and that comes from getting them to believe in something, but as part of reinforcing why they should move towards that behaviour, as part of the sort of charisma that maybe that transformational leader would be. It's been praising, it's showing, and it's helping people and making people feel like they're getting better and stuff like that. And I just see a lot of that, and I just mentioned it for the listeners that if you're ever looking at a really interesting project, I can imagine, and we need to get more work in these areas, is how coaches can actually be that social actor, and I see the relationships, and Mark's offering is a really cool case study in that, I think.
I think it's also about agreeing what you will do for the kids as a coach, or what you'll do for the players as well. Like, for example, I will talk to the players about, I will make promises to them that I'll improve them as a player, but if they buy into my ethos, so they buy into the no swearing, they buy into the turning up on time, they buy into the listening, and when the coach is talking, just that respect stuff, and they will become better players. But also by doing that, they'll become better people. But they're happy with that because you've made a promise to them that you're going to give all your efforts to make them better footballers.
Yeah, so there's a kind of shared contract.
Yeah.
In terms of how you went about that. No, I couldn't agree more. Mark, I think in terms of the question, we've kind of get the point. You've covered a lot of what I was wanting to chat about. I was just wanting to extend the opportunity to, if there's anything that you feel we've missed that we could come back to, because there's so much within that, and try to also keep pace with a lot of it, because there's just so many moving parts a lot of times when we speak on this topic. I just wanted to extend the opportunity. Is there anything you think we need to talk a little bit further about?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing that I'm big on, and that I think we need to understand as football coaches, we can do this, is explain it and understand how the person-centred model of change works. If you're not happy with stuff, don't keep your mouth shut, right? Because there'll be more than you in the room who's not happy with that. So you can change yourself, but you can also change other people by influencing them. So don't think that you're always getting influenced. Think of yourself as an influencer as well, as a player. And we can encourage that as coaches. But I also think that you can look at that in terms of what are the options and choices to these young men here. Right? And it is young men I'm talking about coaching right now. Do they understand what all their options are, what all their choices are, and what the repercussions of their choices will be? Because if you can explain that to them or get that, impart that onto them, they can also do that to their peers. You know, why is it not a good idea to go on a Friday night when you've got a game on a Saturday, for example? Right. So you talk about, right, if you're fresh for your game on your Saturday, you know, what's your options here? Your options are you can go out and hang about with your pals. You know that somebody's going to be drinking. You know there's potentially going to be drugs about. You know there's potentially there can be violence around, depending on what area. And obviously it's not always like that. So, or your other option is you can do PlayStation, or you can just go to one of your mate's house, or you can. Do you know what I mean? What is
Yeah.
the right option? What is the right option there, and what is actually going to help you become a better footballer? Which option? And I think, like, I tell kids, like, I never went out on a Friday night for about 30 years. That's how, obviously, how bad a footballer I was. I had to do everything I could to give myself every advantage. But I didn't drink and I didn't go on a Friday night because I just believed that was the right thing to do if you're respecting yourself as a footballer. But I was probably smart enough in my head to work out that was an option for me. Do you know what I mean? The
Yeah, but
option, I had an option not to go out.
yeah, and other people maybe don't recognise that they do have an option, you know, that they have power. And maybe that is maybe the coach's role is to show people that they have agency over themselves, and it just come back to, you know, how you put a lot of value towards instilling sort of individual thought, and you know that's autonomy, that's agency, that's knowing that you can change your situation and you can change your perspective is an
Yeah, no,
extension of that.
100%. And you can be really subtle about that. One of the best ways I've ever seen this done, I worked with Mike Lawson for my first 2 years in coaching. Mike's incredibly successful as a player, 700 senior games or 650 senior games, and like won a load of trophies as Spartans manager and Whitehill manager. And Mike would say at training, right, guys, listen, it's a big game on Saturday, so maybe Friday night, just 1 pint less, right? Just 1 pint less, right? You know what he's saying with that, right? Right. But
Aye,
he wouldn't be saying you better stay in. And they are from that old school like coaching environment where you better not be that Friday night
aye,
otherwise.
aye,
Right? He'd just say one pint less, guys, just take it seriously. And the message would get
aye.
over.
But is that, and that does that not speak to the idea that we need to, as coaches, consider that you shouldn't always be the external motivation for why someone does something to you. Otherwise, they're always going to require you to be there in order for them to continue to adhere to that. And you kind of want to create an environment through the interactions you have with them that they motivate themselves towards that end product, that end outcome that you want to instill with them. So I see in and I think that's a really nice point to end on, because I see a lot of the stuff we spoke about that's been person centered. You nailed it, put it right in the nail there, whatever that phrase was. I've absolutely butchered. Um, you're understanding the person, their individual needs. You're talking to them in their level. You're not talking to them in a chastising way. You're not blaming them. We're addressing it and being heads on at times when we need to. We can't condone behaviour that we know isn't right. But we're meeting them at a place about where they could be, and not always focusing and putting so much issue on where they're at right now. And then from there, it's how onwards and upwards you can move them to that space. And you spoke as well, Martin, for people that are listening, about the real importance as well, but the culture, the surrounding environment, how you can combat influence, how you can teach about influence is actually a form of building agency in these individuals. And collectively, we're seeing all these things come together and how it has applicability to dealing with a range of social issues, from racism to sectarianism to actually just, demographic issues that we're trying to deal with if it's talking about young men. And again, not in a way that they're always the problem, and not in a way that is always telling them to feel sorry, but to actually at times lift them up, and where you have to, where you have to address that someone's got an ignorant comment, you have to at the same time praise them for having the willingness to talk up and be part of that open communication stream. All these things are so important and they're so nuanced. And I'm just really thankful that you were able to chat to us about that. I think for any coach that's listening, we need to recognise and empower ourselves more to be that social change. It isn't enough to talk about sportsmanship and to listen to the referee. That can be part of it, but you have far
Don't
more
swear at the ref.
potential. Yeah, yeah, we have far more potential than that, and it's maybe somewhere that we need to, if it's about training or education, to empower people. Because that was another thing you said. It can't be, where it may not necessarily be good enough to outsource this and to always rely on others, or to rely on a single practice at a single time. This needs to be a continual behavioural pattern, and we need to equip people in order to actually follow through on that. So I'm just saying that as a summary towards the end here now, and I would just like to thank you, Mark, for coming in and then chatting to us. I hope that was useful for you as well.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about things that I probably don't talk about enough. But I think we're quite often as practitioners, we're busy doing it and not talking about it.
Yeah, yeah, and this is why, and I know we mentioned this. This is why we need to hear more voices from the ground up. I mean, Mark has been doing this far longer than most people who research it have been talking about it, and I just think we need to be conscious, and this is more as a message to other researchers, that we need to be conscious of really trusting and working with and collaborating with people on the ground, because they have insight and real lived experience that is just invaluable, and that will probably direct us towards, if not the answer, then a problem that's more worth our investigation. So, so thanks, Mark. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having
Hopefully,
me.
yeah, absolutely. Hopefully for those that are listening, it's been as useful to you as it has been for me. Yeah, until next time.